we will look at user role and privileges. A user can be created by anybody who has been granted the create user privilege itself. By default, that privilege has been granted to a DBA. So let's connect as a DBA. So you can see here when I connected a system, I have been granted the DBA role, and there's a lot of privileges which have been granted to the DBA role. So there are 220 different privileges. Among them is the create user privilege. So let me connect this. Let me create the user now. When you create a user, by default he cannot connect to the database unless he has been granted the privilege to even connect to the database. So you grant that privilege. And then you can grant him privileges or roles. So I could grant him something called, this is a role which allows him to query the data dictionary views, but not the underlying tables in the sys schema itself. So if I connect as new user, I can query the DBA users view. But I can't query the underlying table that below that is in the sys schema itself. So this is a very useful role that you can grant when you need to create a user that needs to be able to monitor the database. So it's for monitoring users. So it's for like junior DBAs or somebody who's doing performance tuning. That sort of exercises will need this role. I could, and with this role he can't create a user. So because he does not have the create user privilege, let me connect back as somebody with that privilege. Let me create a role. And then grant privileges to the role. The privilege can itself be a role. So I can grant a role to a role. So the grantee role will inherit the privileges of the granted role. I could grant him additional privileges. With the select catalog role, he could only query the data dictionary views. With the select any table privilege, this role can query any table except for the data dictionary tables, the underlying base tables for the data dictionary views. So now with this privilege, select any table. Anybody who has been granted this role can also query the HR schema. So I can query the HR schema because the role that he has been granted to select any table privilege. He can query the data dictionary because one of the roles that he has been granted is a select catalog role, which allows him access to the data dictionary as well. But he can't create any tables. Because he does not have that privilege. So you can always identify what are the privileges. So in this database I have 224 different privileges that can be granted to any user or any role that I create. And privileges on underlying objects are not system privileges, they are object privileges. So there is a different dictionary for that. It's called DBA tab privs. So here you can see these are all preceded accounts which have been granted the select privilege on the employees table. So when you create a user, you can grant him system privileges, you can grant him object privileges. When you create a role, you can grant system privileges and object privileges to the role. You can grant a role to a role, so you can collapse one role into another role, and then you can grant that role to a user. The advantage with roles is if you have 400 users and you want to grant privileges on 400 tables, select, insert, update, delete. That's 4 different privileges. That's 1600 privileges on 400 tables. Multiply by 400 users. That's 64,000 different grants you have to give. So instead of that, you grant those 1600 privileges to one role and then grant that one role to the 400 users. So you are combining multiple grants into a role, and then you just grant the role once to all the users. And of course you can create a hierarchy of roles if you want to. So you can have one subset of roles granted to a group of users, another set of roles with more privileges granted to another set of users which require the escalated privileges. So to identify, you should be familiar with these views. DBSS privs shows you all the privileges granted to different grantees. DBA tab privs shows you all the privileges on different table names granted to different grantees. The grantee for a privilege, whether it's system or table, can be a role or a user. DBA roles shows you all the roles that have been created in the database. DBA role privs shows you what roles have been granted to which grantee. So the grantee for a role also could be another role or a user. So here you can see that I have connected as another user, I have been granted the new monitor role. And the new monitor role itself has been granted the select catalog role. So I can go on looking up different privileges. Similarly, I could have queried the DBA tab privs to identify the privileges granted to this user or to this role.